Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Cyclonic Thrift Podcast, a series focusing on deck building, card analysis, and financial speculation, all through the eyes of a commander player on a budget. I'm one of your hosts, Christian, joined as always by
Zach. Welcome to the podcast, everyone.
And we're happy to have you. This is our first ever episode of the Cyclonic Thrift, and as you heard, it's going to be a series that's going to be focusing on doing all of Commander on a budget. And there's plenty of other podcasts that have, budget analysis of decks and how to do them with a limit. And that's going to be kind of what we're doing here, but we have a really particular way of doing things. Zach, I don't know if you want to jump in and talk more about that.
Yeah, so we've been playing with this kind of format for the last couple of years here with our small play group, and we've seen a lot of differences between this and regular Commander. We think there are a lot of advantages to it, so we'll talk a little bit how it works versus a normal Commander format. So this follows the standard Commander format rulings. All the decks are 100 card decks. The main difference is there's a $50 cap on the cost of the deck.
Along with that, the commander isn't part of that cap, and neither are the basics. So you have the $50 cap. If you want to build, someone crazy, like Locust God or something like that, the price does not go into the $50, and neither do all the islands or mountains you would incorporate in the deck.
Yeah, and so the card prices that we use, or the way that we determine the overall cost of the deck, is that we look at the cheapest near mint printing at the time that the deck is constructed. So if TCG player has all these cards for $49.99 plus the cost of Locust Scout in this case, then you're good to go. You're within the budget.
Exactly. So again, it's not really a format. It's just kind of a restriction we've given ourselves in the Commander format. And the big difference for us is the whole playgroup follows this. You might sit down with your playgroup and you just watched a video on how to build a budget Grand Arbiter Augustine IV deck. Great. But you're sitting at the table with a competitive Animar deck, a competitive, anything really, or the Miststalker deck. You're still going to be in trouble, and you may not get as much fun out of it being not necessarily disadvantaged, but you don't have every tool you could possibly have. With our play group, everyone's agreed upon these rules, everyone enjoys them, and it's made a really interesting environment for, I think, all of us. And I think all of us would agree that, sure, we miss playing things like your Force of Negations and, your crazy commander staples. But at the end of the day, I think all of us are happier in this budget format we've created.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are a lot of advantages that we're going to get into later in this that we've all found with the budget format. There's a huge variety of decks that we get to play with and cards that most people just never get to see because they're slightly worse version of an existing card or just not quite as powerful as some other card out there that costs 10 times as much that you would normally include in that deck.
Exactly. And like you said, just all these different cards. We'll get into this more, but we get excited at commons now. I think a lot of times the commons will come out during a spoiler season and you'll kind of scroll past them. Maybe if you're really into limited, you'll look a little bit deeper. At the end of the day, everyone's focused on the rares and the big mythics and things like that. But Zach and I, along with our play group, we get really excited at, wow, that common, that's good because it's going to be cheap. And that's going to be another kind of aspect of the podcast is speculating on the finances of these cards, because not only do you have to evaluate the power of a card, there's kind of power versus value now, where the card has its own power, but is the price tag on it worth being incorporated into your deck? And it's one of the cool restrictions that come with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're ready to kind of jump into an example here and just make sure we explain how the this works in practice when you're actually building a deck. So the example that we were going to give is, if say you wanted to build an Nefera God of Apollos deck. So we'll say that today's card market price for that is sitting at $644 for the commander. So the rest of the deck, not including the basic lands that you would include, would be $50. So plains and islands would not count towards that.
Right. So again, it's just your commander, your basic lands. They don't have any impact on this $50 deck. Now, getting into the building of it, Once you start selecting those cards for the 99, if you want to include something in the deck like Venser Shaper Savant, I'm last time I checked, his cheapest near mint printing available was from Time Spiral Remastered, and he was sitting at about 243, $2.43. So if you did decide by the end of your deck building or throughout your deck building that he is going in the deck and he's definitely going in the deck, you would subtract that $2.43 from your $50 budget. So you've now begun to subtract from your budget, and as you add things, you'll continue to subtract.
Yeah, and one other thing we'd like to mention is just a lot of us like to purchase foil cards or full art lands, anything like that, just to kind of make the deck look nice. And you we don't count that toward the budget of the deck when you actually go put that in your cart and buy it. We're specifically looking at just the cheapest near mint price, so you can do whatever you want as far as alternate arts or anything like that.
Yep, you can bling out the deck as much as you want. It doesn't affect any of the power of the cards, obviously. It's strictly for looks. We just chose the cheapest near mint printing of the card based on the TCG player market price as a guideline. If by the end of this podcast or throughout this podcast you really like our concept of this kind of restricted budget format for Commander, and you think you'd rather use the cheapest light play version of a card or the most expensive printing of a card as your restriction for deck building, go ahead. If you want to make the budget $100 instead of 50, that's fine too. But we really wanted to break down this, again, sort of kind of format, these restrictions to Commander we've given our play group, just so moving forward you can always know what the perspective is, what the eyes are for looking at cards and decks and things like that. So you're aware of what we have to keep in mind when choosing those cards.
Yep. And something that we like to do, obviously, is spoiler season comes around, a new set gets released, and we all like to look at the new spoilers and upgrade our decks every once in a while. And we have a process for that. We're fairly lenient with this process as far as the card price and things like that. As long as we stay within or close to that $50 budget, uh, you know, we say, if I want to add a new card that just came out that's sitting at $2 market price, I'll swap out a card that's sitting at the same price that's already in the deck and just straight replace it with that new card. So we're fairly lenient with rules like that.
Yep, it's again, at the end of the day, it's a pretty casual format. Everyone is trying to win, everyone's trying their hardest to win, but yeah, again, like Zach said, there's some leniency. We're all just trying to have fun with it. And it's already a format that adds its own level of fun with the restrictions and things like that. Um, and like Zach said, it's a simple swap it in, swap it out in terms of price. $2 card comes out, you take out a $2 card in your deck currently and put it in there. Another example for me is the whole strictly worse, strictly better cards that come out. I have a Marin of Clan Neltoth budget deck, and in the deck I was running Altars Reap. One in a black, an instant, as an additional cost to cast Altars Reap, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. Well, when Ixalan came out, a card came with a set called Costly Plunder. Same exact card, same price, instant speed, draw 2 cards, except you could also sacrifice an artifact instead of a creature if you could, or if you wanted to. It's a strictly better version of Altars Reap. So again, I don't have to go to our play group and say, hey guys, I'm doing this. I can just do it freely, knowing that it's a strictly better version of a card. It's roughly the same price. And it's just an upgrade. And it's simple as that to swap it in and out. Even though I made Marin probably a year or two before Ixalan actually came out. So it's not something to get hung up on when it comes to upgrading. It's still all about the fun. When something cool comes out, you can add it as long as you're not trying to replace a $2 card with a $10 card or something like that.
Yep. And the next thing that we wanted to talk about is just, why did we decide to start this format? What was wrong with Commander back in the day when we first started playing? Because we were all playing for several years before we really decided to start doing these budget games, and there were several different reasons that we decided to start this. The main one is accessibility. So, over the years, as Commander's gotten more and more popular, and it's makes up a majority of the paper card players left that are they're still playing the physical formats. it really drives the price on the secondary market for cards. And over time, these cards, especially powerful things, are just getting more and more expensive. And we felt that after a certain point, we're just going to be priced out of this game. And we obviously didn't like that. And there were other things as well, like if you're willing to spend $1,500 on a deck, obviously you're going to be able to afford more powerful cards than someone else who's only going to spend $500 on a deck.
Right. And it's not to say that Magic is pay to win. I mean, we love Magic. Between Zach and I, we have probably close to 12 years game time between the two of us among our entire play group. It's probably closer to 30, 40 years of playing the game. All the time we've played added. So we really enjoy this game. We've put a lot of money into it. We put a lot of time into it. We play as often as we can. But at the end of the day, a guy like Zach said who can dish out $1,500 for a deck is going to have a more powerful deck than the guy who spent $100 on a deck. And again, it's about accessibility. We want everyone to be able to play at the same level, no problem.
Yeah, and that's one of the advantages that we see to this format. Uh, Along with a few other things, like Christian said, everybody's at pretty even power levels. We all have access to the same kind of group of cards. Uh, and one of the other advantages is that this allows us to build a lot more decks than we would if we were all playing extremely expensive decks. Obviously, I can build, uh, you know, 10 budget decks for the price that would cost me to build probably one like CEDH level, no budget cap deck. So we get to see a lot larger variety of decks and play with a lot more decks than we would otherwise.
Right, exactly. I agree. That's one of my favorite things about this kind of format we have here where, you know, sometimes playgroups can get a little stale because everyone's playing with the same two decks, whereas our meta, as it were, in our playgroup is always changing because one month I'll sit down with a Winota deck and it's new and it's cool, and then a month later you'll sit down with a Calamex deck, and now that's a new thing that shows up in the playgroup. How do we do with this? How do we play against this? And next month someone else might sit down with another deck. It's just always adding, it's always changing, but it also doesn't feel overwhelming. It just gives us a nice pool and a nice variety to play Commander with. And it's been a really fun experience to see everyone bringing new decks fairly frequently. It's not always month to month that someone shows up with a new deck, but I'd say in the play group, on average, every 3 to 4 months, 1 to 2 people bring a new deck. And I think that's a good rate to see new decks show up in the meta, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really, like you said, it keeps the meta healthy. In one day I could play 3 or 4 different decks. If we play, 6 games in a day or something, we all get together. You never know what you're gonna see. You could see, a control deck versus a couple battle cruiser decks. The meta is just really constantly changing, and there's uh, no limit. Nobody's overly concerned with how strong a commander is because you kind of eliminate some of the really strong archetypes. Like nobody's going to be playing a Prosh food chain deck in this format, obviously, because
Yep.
it's just you can't with a
Mm-hmm.
$50 budget. So,
Yep. That is a really good point. And we've kind of fallen into the what we like about the format. We want to go through everything, why we did it, how it works, what we like about it. Some of the whys are also the whats. It just after playing it for so long. How long do you think we've been playing the format, Zach? 3, 4 years now, maybe more.
yeah, I think it's been about 4 years now. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wouldn't change a thing. I don't even think I'd go back. Sure, there's some days I have a CEDH Animar deck. Every once in a while, maybe I'd like to bust it out. And we have done that before. But at the end of the day, I don't regret playing this format. I don't wish that I wasn't playing this format. And I think our entire play group would agree with us.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
I also want to talk about, you mentioned a CEDH deck, and I just mentioned I have an Animar deck. Um, that's one of the other whys as to why we went to this format, at least for some people in the play group. I'm one of those people, and got to a point where the power level of the decks, sure, there was cool interactions sometimes and some crazy moments that I remember playing with our competitive decks, but you know, the joke about CDH is, turn 2 or turn 3, somebody's comboing off and the game's over. And we kind of got to that point to a degree, and it just, I think people weren't having fun. Just as an example, we had a CEDH Animar deck, a competitive Brea deck, a competitive Zur deck, all sitting at the same table, and a Mayel of the Anima competitive deck, all sitting at the same table. And man, there's some cool stuff, but it you experience it for 2 turns, 3 turns, because the guy went Soul Ring, Mana Vault, Mana Crypt, the whole thing, and their whole combo pieces out by turn 2. And this format just doesn't allow for that. It just cannot happen. Sure, you can go Soul Ring Signet if you're running those, which I think most people are. I try to fit Soul Ring into most of my decks. If you can't, you can't. It's just part of the restrictions. But the fastest you can go is Soul Ring Signet in most cases, and that's not enough to win you the game.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Christian brought up a good point when he was talking about things that kind of staples that we try to run in our format. For example, Soul Ring. Obviously it's an extremely powerful and popular commander card, but in some cases, with our budget restriction, it's just you have to choose between that or something that combos with your commander or is extremely synergistic and just makes your deck work. So I think we're adding a lot of kind of decisions in the deck building process that you wouldn't have if you were willing to spend a lot more money to build a deck.
Right. And I know the whole restriction breeds creativity argument is something in the Magic community that you're either for or against, kind of in the middle. It's a good topic of discussion, of course. And honestly, after starting this format, I'm definitely in the camp of restrictions do breed creativity, because at least, if not creativity, better players. Because I think, Zach, you would agree that everyone in our play group is a significantly better player than they were before we started this format, because now you really look at a card very analytically and say, if you have no budget, pick whatever you want, no problem. But now you have to say, man, is this card really more valuable, more powerful, more synergistic than this card? And not just because of it's better or not, but because can you afford to run it? Is its price worth its power? And I think that's a really cool concept to add to deck building.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even over the last couple of years, as we've been doing this process, we've seen people improve both in deck building and actual playing. We've seen the meta really change from a lot of more battle cruisery decks to begin with, transitioning into more combo decks and things like that, and just higher power decks, higher power levels over time, while still maintaining the same budget.
Right, exactly. And I think you've heard us throw around the words like competitive and meta and winning here and there, and we're aware of the CDH trends. Like I said, our play group is like, including Zach and I, we are competitive Magic players. We want to win the game. Of course, if we sit down and it's fun and we don't get a win that day, it was still a fun day, but it always feels a little bit bad when you don't win any. So don't think because we're in this format, we aren't competitive. We still care highly about the meta in our play group. Like Zach said, we start off, there's some battle cruisers, some aggro, maybe a spell slinger deck was in there, and then a couple combo decks came out and they started winning. And then some people built some control and some mid range, those started winning. Now there's some really intensive aggro decks have shown up and they're winning. A lot of value decks are popping up now. So the meta, like we talked about earlier, is constantly shifting, but it's coming from a concept of competitiveness that still exists and might even be more extreme, not to a toxic level, but from a how can I win this week type of level.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, there are a lot of considerations, especially, I feel like I'm kind of beating this horse to death a little bit here, but from a budget perspective, let's say, the meta's evolved to the point where a lot of people are playing a lot of graveyard recursion or something like that. If I look at cards that I think maybe will counter that strategy, maybe I want to include a Bajuka Bog or something in my deck. That's another decision I have to make is, do I want to spend $2-3 on this Bajuka Bog? Is it worth it to me to include that card to counter that particular strategy? Or is that just not going to pay off in the end when I go to play this deck?
Right, exactly. Your utility is now a luxury at times, and that's a cool concept as well. Um, Another thing I like about this format that we talk about a lot, Zach, is there are some commanders you would think everything would just get nerfed, right? Every commander would just be a little bit worse than it could be because of the restrictions. But some commanders actually get better in the format. And it's because decks that could shut them down aren't as oppressive. Like you mentioned, Prosh Food Chain. Some slower battlecruiser deck could not keep up with that. But since it doesn't exist and there's nothing really like it, some battlecruiser deck might be totally fine or even better than a Prosh deck. And I think that is something really cool and something to keep in mind when building in this format, because your options almost increase because of the fact that you're not forced to run these staples in these decks anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good example is our play group has a Rakdos deck that kind of runs a lot of just big minions that are probably worse than other cards that exist, but are cheap and would normally get removed right away to some kind of board wipe or something like that. But in our format, there's not a ton of board wipes that are going to be run because of the price of board wipes and removal, and you have a lot more opportunity to get those things to stick to the board and actually do some work for you before they get removed.
Definitely, definitely. That is a good example. I think even a Kurkesh deck is another one in our play group,
Hmm.
played by the same player actually. And I know that deck has some good combo potential um, in a normal non-budget environment, but because of the restrictions, some decks get a little bit slower. But there's some artifact-based combos that stick around with the budget. You just have to find them, and that's one of the Kurkesh player did, and it's actually a deck that wins a good bit. It's a strong deck. It's a fun deck to have at the table, I think. And it's very interesting to see a mono red combo deck, as it were, succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, another kind of component of that is that a lot of the combos that you see, out in the wild with these CEDH decks are going to be, one card combo with your commander, Curiosity plus Niv Mizzet, something like that. That's I just find this one card and I basically win the game. Whereas in budget, usually we're looking at like two or three card commanders, or sorry, two or three card combos to win the game, or even more in some cases, because we can't afford to pay $12 plus for each piece of this combo. Usually the most expensive combo piece that we typically see will be like a Deadeye Navigator.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, for sure. I think that probably is this the most expensive combo piece in our play group,
Hmm.
arguably. I'm sure there's a couple more here and there that I'm not thinking of, but I also think that's the most um what's the word on it? I guess obvious one, because when you sit down at a CEDH table, like we talked about, the food chain, it's going to be there. Um, Before it's banned, Paradox Engine would have been there. There's all these cards that are like, yep, those are the combo pieces in CEDH, and like Thracios, it's kind of boring after a while. But when we sit down at a table, yeah, once you see the deck a couple times, but there's plenty of times when you brought a new table to the deck. Brought a new deck to the table, Zach, that I was like, I'm sitting here thinking, I'm looking at every card you're laying, saying, okay, I know this deck is got combo and good interactions, but what's the combo piece here? And I'd like to think I'm a fairly good Magic player. We've talked about the different levels of skill different players have at identifying threats or deck building, whatever your strengths may be. I think you and I are pretty good at identifying threats on the table. So I'm looking and I'm saying, what's the combo piece here? And every deck, again, since there's a plethora of cards you never see because there's better things to run than them, you're now seeing, and they're vital to whatever game plan or strategy you have. I think I could be wrong, but I think your newest Corval deck has a couple pieces that I'd never seen, and I'm like, wow, that's sweet. you were spitting out goblins like over and over. I'd never seen that card before, and I was like, wow, okay, now I know future games I'm gonna wipe that card out immediately because it's just good.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of cases like that, with Corvo. But then, I remember a game where we played against you. You're playing Azuri, and you ended up had a bunch of counters on something, and then you played a card, and I think Bio shifted all the counters onto something else, and ended up getting infinite combat steps or infinite turns. I think just kind of out of
Right.
nowhere, and I had no idea that that card existed. Didn't really see the combo coming, but it was we just have these crazy moments like that where you don't expect anybody to win, and then they do just out of the blue.
Yeah, and I think that's also another thing is the decks that win in CDH win, but in our format, each round, I really don't know what deck's going to come out on top. And again, that's one of the fun of Commander. There's some randomness to it. There's some craziness. You never know what's going to happen, but I think it's amplified a little bit in this budget format because just the nature of the decks. They're all equal levels. They're all doing different things, and I think this is something that doesn't really fall into the format necessarily, and this is more of our play group, which it's still good to talk about again, so you know what type of environment we're speaking from when talking about cards. Our play group builds really hard, and you can disagree, Zach, but I would say our play group builds really hard into the synergy of decks. A player, when it comes down to, I try to always have the removal and the card draw I need and the utility, but if it's between a utility card and pushing my game plan, I'm more likely going to push my game plan. I think most people in our play group do that.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, there's only so much removal that you can afford, like we said, and then you know we're not going to be able to afford, in some cases, the absolute best cards that synergize with our commander. So you really have to try to just have as much gas in the deck as you can, whether it's the most efficient thing or not. You never know what you're going to be able to do with it, and gotta pack in as much value as you can within that limited budget.
That's true. I didn't even think about it in that way that, because we don't have access to, well, Hero's Downfall and things like that, you kind of have access to it, but the really good removal, um, like Vandal Blast, for example, don't
Hmm.
always have access to it, or Active Treason or something, which I think you could probably fit in. I haven't looked at the price in a while. Not Active Treason. What's the 13 damage burn spell? Like board wipes everything. It's free or it's really cheap. I
Yeah,
can't.
I'm blanking on
Yeah,
the
I can't
name.
remember what it's called, but it's the red spell that burns everything. I think that's borderline budget, not really, but in red, it's good board wipe, as it were. These type of things we don't have access to. So sometimes you're gonna say, man, do I really want to take this mediocre removal when I could just add, like you said, more gas to my deck? And in a way, that makes the deck so much cooler because, yeah, of course we have removal, we have ways to deal with things, and that's extremely important to have interaction in a deck. But in the day, just seeing these decks go 100 miles an hour, full throttle with their game plan is super cool. I love to see all the decks just popping off at once.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, there are a lot of considerations with these decks. Like, for example, I built a Grand Arbiter deck a few years ago, a budget deck, and it was interesting because I never tried to really build control like that in this format. And I think, my takeaway was that it didn't really work the way I wanted it to, because there's just I tried to pack in as much card draw as I could, because obviously you're not going to be able to afford things like our namesake card, Cyclonic Thrift, or anything like that. You're going to have to take board wipes that are kind of subpar, and you know just try to run with it. And in some cases it's going to work, and in some cases it's just not enough. Like, obviously Grand Arbiter is going to be a huge target at whatever table you're at, so you kind of have to factor that in. When you're doing your deck building, you got to think about, how am I going to protect my commander if he's essential to my deck, and how am I really going to win this game? So,
Right, yeah. You kind of try to do the fill my hand with as much control as possible so I have access to it as opposed to, you know, grabbing a couple just top of the line control spells.
yep,
And yeah, and that's a cool way to look at it. I think there's plenty of decks in our playgroup that, the standard build for it is not necessarily viable because you've lost so many pieces. due to budget restrictions. And now, again, we keep going back to Prosh. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but Prosh competitive, it's going to be food chain 9 times out of 10. In this format, you could do Prosh sack value, you could do tokens, you could do Voltron, and they're all probably going to be equally viable. Of course, a Prosh Voltron may not be good as a Rafik of the Many Voltron or something, but in terms of Prosh deck to Prosh deck to Prosh deck, they're probably all relatively viable against one another in these different archetypes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that really adds a lot of value to the format and just makes games much more fun than if I were going to sit down and play a mirror matchup against other prospects. Just it's much more fun.
Agreed. Is there anything else you want to talk about in terms of the format itself, why we did it, what we like about it? Anything else you want to mention about it?
I think that was pretty much it for me. I think we touched on everything. Huge variety of decks and everything. I think that was the main thing we wanted to get across is just that we really enjoy this format and think that there are a lot of advantages to this over traditional.
Yep. I think it's also important to mention before we move on from it is if you're obviously Magic cards are always going up. Zach is very interested in Magic finance and he keeps up with all those things. And he can tell you that cards are always going up and they're always going to go up for the most part. And, if a reprint happens, sure, it knocks it down a little bit for a while. End of the day, it's probably going to find its way at least close to where it once was, depending on the card. Even though we've seen this with Tarmogoyf and Noble Hierarch time and time again, eventually they get knocked down, but one reprint does not do the job. My point in this is in our play group, in this format, if you want to follow this format, if you want to start doing it, whatever, when you've built the deck, all of us date the deck. Again, like Zach said, the time of construction is what's important when determining the prices. Let's say you built the deck today at the time of recording, which is June 17th. Let's say you finished the deck and it's $50 or $49.50 or something like that, right close to the mark, and it's done. 3 years from now, that deck is probably going to be closer to $75, $80. And that's okay. It doesn't affect the format. We don't care about that. Of course, you could argue that newer decks are going to maybe be a little bit worse than older decks because the cards were cheaper then and they're more now, so you can't incorporate them. That's an argument. Maybe it's a flaw in the format. Arguably, again, at the end of the day, we don't really care, and our decks still compete. I think my first deck was Worth the Raid Mother. Zach, I think you could confirm this. Winota, the new Winota deck I have, could easily take on Worth the Raid Mother any day of the week, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think.
And that might just be an archetype thing. Maybe she's just, too aggro or something for Wart, or, maybe Wart can hold off the aggro with the tokens until the big burn spell comes out. Whatever. But at the end of the day, I think they're relatively at a similar level. I would not say Winota's, 10 times weaker just because I made her 5 years later. And cards are cheaper, more expensive, or whatever. But at the end of the day, our decks, no matter when they're made, as long as they're $50 at the time of construction, if they're $100 now, you can still run them. Again, this is more of a playgroup thing. If you sit down at a table at a card shop, they're not going to care your budget or your price or any of that stuff. But in terms of your playgroup, keeping things fair, keeping things fun, at the end of the day, fun is the center of it all. And no one's going to make you make a new version of a deck because it's now $80 opposed to the 50 when you made it. As long as it's 50 at the time of construction, you're good forever.
Yep, exactly. And I think a good example of that is I had a Ascend triplets deck back in the day that's now worth like $150 or something like that because I just had one card in there. I had a Mycosynth Lattice that I think was like $5 or $6 at the time that I built the deck, and now it's like a $70 card. So it doesn't mean that the deck is that much better than it was when I started. It just sometimes
cards go up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think you had a foil Ascend triplets too, right?
Yep.
That went up. Yeah. And yeah, like you're saying, sometimes it's just the shinier cards make it go up and things like that. But also a kind of cool aspect of the format with talking about this part of it in a way, this format gets you to buy low if you want to look at it financially. You're
Yeah.
buying all these cards at a low price because you need it to be low so you can fit in the deck. 4 years from now, if you ever sell the deck, you probably made money. Odds are you made money.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's another kind of interesting thing about the format is that, over time, personally, I'll usually only have 5 or 6 decks at a time. If I find that I have, more than that, I'll usually retire decks, disassemble them, kind of take those pieces, maybe sell some of them, keep some of them in my binders or whatever. And I just don't like to have that many decks at one time. But it's always interesting to see how much the value of those cards is appreciated from the time that I've bought them to the time that I disassemble the deck.
Yeah, and not every card's like that. I'm a very green player. Zach can tell you that I love green. That's my color. The first 4 decks all had green in them when we started this format, and all of them have rampant growth. But rampant growth is never going to be a $10 card, which that's good, so I can run it. But not every card is going to net you money gain 4 years from now. But at the end of the day, overall, your deck that cost you $50, that is an investment. You can look at it that way as an investment of $50, and you might get a return of $25. You might get a return of $30. In Zach's case, with the Microsynth Lattice Spike and the foil centriplets, it was $100 return. But that's awesome, or maybe even more than that. And that's just another extra little bonus, I think, to playing this format.
Yep, yep, I agree. It's just always interesting. It's not something to count on, not something to consider probably when you're buying the cards, but it's always
Right.
cool just to see.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely not something we're not speculating on cards when we build the decks.
Yeah.
We speculate on cards other than building decks. We might look at a card and look at a set coming out and say, "Oh, that might go up. Let's get it." But we never do that when constructing decks for this format. So, we talked about the format a lot, Zach. We talked about everything we like about it. I guess one more thing before we move on. Is there anything we don't like? We've talked about nothing but good things up to this point. I honestly don't really know anything I don't like about what we play with our friends.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, you're playing Commander, and obviously we all
Yep.
love Commander. We wouldn't be here if we didn't. The
Yep.
only, we've had conversations, Kirsten and I, about, what would happen if we increased the budget to $100 or something like that. How much more powerful would these decks get if we did that? We've talked about it, but at the end of the day, it's really up to the play group, right? If you wanted to do $100, $50, $500, at the end of the day, it's all scalable, right? It's just
Yep.
whatever you decide to do, as long as you're all at the same budget, you're all have access to the same cards. You're going to be at a hopefully a similar power level, when you sit down to play.
Yep, exactly. And yeah, I don't see anything negative with the format. I think it's all good things. And like you said, it's all scalable. It keeps everybody at the same level. And we've talked about the $100 up, and I think everyone $50 just feels good. It's not easy for everyone just to spend $50 on cardboard. We get that. But in terms of Magic the Gathering costs and prices and accessibility, $50 just feels like that sweet spot. And I think Zach, we talked about this with everyone in our play group. Really, we wholeheartedly believe, and actually have seen our decks take on higher level, maybe not CEDH cutthroat competitor decks, but high level, no budget in mind decks, and win several times. It it just again, I think part of it comes from the fact that we're all just better deck builders now, and we really focus on the cards that make a difference in the deck. And our decks, I mean, I think there's some of them, of course, are as fine tuned as they can get within the restrictions.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, there's a big difference between the process that we go through and maybe, the average person goes through when building their deck. Like, I could go to EDH Rec right now and look at, what are the top most synergistic cards with this commander that I want to build, and I could put those all in the deck. Obviously, that's going to get expensive, but if I have to look and figure out, okay, I absolutely need to protect this guy because the deck doesn't work, right? So I've got to really make a lot more decisions about, how much utility am I going to take and how much just gas am I going to take to try to synergize with this. And at the end of the day, we're constantly fine-tuning these decks based on the results of games or results of testing these decks, individually. And I think they're about as tuned as they're going to get in most cases.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all in all, it's a great format. Again, if you like Commander, like you said, that's why we're here. We like getting to go with the guys, sitting at the table, playing some Commander, then going out back, flipping some burgers, having a good time. It's just all about having fun with your friends. And we just found that this is the easiest, most accessible, and best way to do it for everybody. Everyone wins. And we just have a blast doing it. And the decks are they're highly competitive, with the restrictions in place. And again, the big thing for us is I don't know about everyone listening, what your play groups are like. I think we all, Zach, you probably would agree. We have pretty rational, reasonable people in our play group. Everyone's just looking to have fun. They want to win, but they're looking to have fun. And I don't think there's ever been a time where someone said, man, I hate that we're playing budget. I think everyone is happier that we're playing budget.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I mean, we all that's the goal at the end of the day, right? Is we all just want to have fun, and we're competitive, and that we'll build our decks as best as we can. But it never gets to the point where people are going to get bent out of shape that they're not winning or anything. It's it might drive you to go home and build a different deck or try to improve
Yeah.
your deck or something like that. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, we all have fun.
Yeah, there's been plenty of times where I've gotten home and said, "Man, I should probably just disassemble this." I usually
Yep.
don't. I think I've only done that once ever, disassembled a deck. Not because I was tilted or something, but it just it just didn't it wasn't as fun as I want it to be. And winning is fun. If we're being honest, winning is fun. When you win, it's a good time. And this deck just wasn't winning. It had an identity crisis, and that was one of my earlier decks. And I think since then I've just like we said, all of us are just better deck builders, and this format I think has really done that. And you mentioned EDH Rec. We don't have the luxury of just going there, looking at the highest synergy cards and clicking add to card, add to card, add to deck, add to deck. We have to think about it because wow, do I really want to pay $6 for this card? Even though it's super synergistic, is that's actually what I want to be doing with this $6 of my deck. That's a sizable percentage in your $50 budget.
Yep. Absolutely.
So I think we've rambled on long enough about our format. Obviously, we like it. Obviously, we think it's great. We gave all the guidelines for it. I think right before we end the episode, we'll go through what the restrictions are again, just so it's easy on everyone's mind and you know exactly what those restrictions are. And again, we just really wanted to give this summary on our first episode, so in future episodes when we say, "Oh, that card looks great," you know why. You understand what the circumstances are, you understand our format, you understand our play group, and you understand what we like about the card and why we like it. Zach and I thought that was important to nail before going any further. But speaking of future episodes, we kind of want to do a quick little thing, just talking about, what our next episode might look like, what our next 5 episodes might look like. Not getting anything specific, but what you can expect as the podcast moves further. Zach, you want to start with, what the future entails for us?
Yeah, so everything that we're going to be doing content-wise on this podcast, like we said at the beginning, is just it's going to be Magic through the eyes of a Commander player who is, playing in this budget format. So we're going to be talking about decks that people are running uh, in the budget format, as well as cards that we think are great that you might not know about because they're, maybe a not quite as good version of another popular card. We're going to be talking about upcoming cards from Modern Horizons 2 or future sets that we think are going to be budget staples and are uh, going to be making an appearance in our decks in the future. A lot of things like that.
Yep. We're gonna be, we like to do top fives, top tens, best green cards from Modern Horizons, best white cards, five best cards from Modern Horizons, and just an overall set review, things like that. That's the goal for the next episode, is focusing on Modern Horizons too. But beyond that, I think we both want to do deck techs of decks in the play group, our own decks. We want to talk about, card speculation in terms of how good it's going to be. We want to talk about finance of cards. Is this card going to become budget? Is this card going to leave the budget, threshold? And that's arguable. If you're willing to dish out $5 for a card in this budget, that's fine. But I think our border, Zach, is for me a $2 mark is where I start to say, man, is this card worth it? Maybe even $3. I don't know where that threshold is for you, but
Yeah. At the end of the day, I mean, I figure you're really looking at like your average card price has got to be around 40 cents, right? After you take out the basic lands and everything, you got 60 couple cards, 65 maybe left out of the 99. So you really got to figure out, what am I willing to spend more than this 40 cents or so on that is really gonna, make this deck better and allow me to win this game, or, remove threats, things like that.
right, exactly. That's a good way to look at it. That average because of the $50 and everything. That's a good way to look at that, and that's something you have to keep in mind when you're building. And so we'll look at cards with that perspective. We'll decide what cards we think are good, which ones we think are bad. As I mentioned, deck techs, deck building. I'd like to someday do deck doctor. Someone submits a deck that is under the budget and say how can I make this better within the $50? And I think that'd be fun to work on deep in the future. I think Zach and I would love to do videos of matches, commander versus, if you will, of our playgroup playing games. I think that'd be fun, and I think he thinks so as well. Doing that because it's just fun to see games happen
Yep.
and seeing it in our format. It's kind of important. I think it's important to see how it actually plays, so we're not all talk, right? But that is in the future. That takes a lot of equipment and higher production, and we hope to get there someday, but it's not today, and that's okay. We just are fine talking about our format, talking about Magic, a game we love, talking about Commander, our favorite format. And I think that's going to be the general idea. As we said, that's the idea of this podcast, is just talk about Magic, talk about Commander on a budget.
Yep. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, is there anything else that you would like to mention, Zach, before we close this episode out?
No, I think that's it for me. I think we covered everything. We appreciate everybody tuning in, listening to what we have to say, and hopefully you all enjoyed it.
Yep, and we are happy to have all of you. Again, just to close it out, checklist of the format. Our budget format follows the standard Commander format rulings. All decks are constructed with a $50 cap. Commanders and basic lands do not count towards that $50 cap. And the prices of cards are determined by the cheapest near mint printing based on TCG Player market price listings at the time the deck is constructed. And that's it. I mean, 3 simple restrictions, really, because you just follow the Commander format like normal. 3 simple restrictions, and you have a format that is accessible, fun, and I think unique. I think it's a unique format, and we have a blast playing it, Zach.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, if you liked listening to the Cyclonic Thrift Podcast, we are again working on getting our content more accessible on different platforms and social media outlets, working on setting up a Discord. All that's to come. When all of that is set up, you'll find in the description below. Again, if you liked listening to us, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it, especially with a brand new podcast starting up. But at the end of the day, we're just doing this for fun. We want to bring good content to the listeners and make Commander more accessible for everybody. So any other closing remarks, Zach?
Nope, I'm all good.
All right. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.